Okay. Imagine the scenario for a second. It's pretty baffling. You've lived legally in the United States for what, over a decade. You've built a family, raising U.S. citizen kids. You're doing the whole annual immigration check-in thing, like, meticulously.
Following the rules.
Exactly. And then, boom, one single bewildering, they call it an administrative error, and you're suddenly deported. And not just anywhere, but to this notorious foreign prison by your own government.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't some, like, dystopian story plot. This is real life. This is the saga of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
That's right, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a Maryland man who, yeah, like you said, was living safely, had his wife, his kids, all U.S. citizens. But the really critical piece here, the legal piece, is he had this protection. It's called a withholding order.
Okay.
And that specifically forbade deporting him back to his home country, El Salvador. Why? Because an immigration judge had already determined there was a clear probability of future persecution if he went back.
A clear probability. So the system knew he was in danger there.
The system formally acknowledged it, yes.
Yeah. And yet, despite this clear legal stop sign, March 15th, 2025, he's put on a plane, removed from the U.S., and ends up detained in El Salvador's Center for Terrorism Confinement. CCOT.
CCOT, yeah.
The truly shocking part, and I think this is what makes this case just, well, extraordinary, is the U.S. government pretty quickly admitted it. They've said the removal was illegal. It was the result of a simple administrative error. I mean, how does an error like that even happen?
Well, that's exactly the mystery, isn't it? That's the core of what we're trying to unravel today. We're going to take a deep dive into this really unprecedented case. Yeah. We need to unpack the legal fights, the politics swirling around it, the spin, and these huge questions it raises about due process, about government power. What does it actually mean to be protected by the rule of law? We've got some surprising facts, I think, some aha moments that go way beyond the headlines you might have seen.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Let's unpack Kilmar Abrego Garcia's journey. It starts around 2011, right? He immigrates illegally. He's only 16. What was he running from, and how did that sort of set the stage?
He was fleeing very real gang threats back in El Salvador. His family, they had these grudges from gangs who were trying to recruit him. Later, these gangs even forced his parents to pay weekly fees like protection money for their small home business.
Wow.
So yeah, from the very start, he was looking for refuge. It was a genuinely dangerous situation he left behind.
Okay, so fast forward. Years later, 2019, he gets arrested. He's just looking for work outside a Home Depot in Maryland, right? With 3 other guys.
That's right.
And here's where it gets really, really unsettling for me. He wasn't actually charged with any crime, and the initial reasons they flagged him for possible gang ties, they seem incredibly flimsy.
Oh, absolutely flimsy. Detectives wrote down notes about his Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie he was wearing that had money graphics on it.
A hoodie?
Yeah, and they claimed these things were, quote, indicative of the Hispanic gang culture. His wife later said, look, I bought him that hoodie from Fashion Nova because I liked the design. It wasn't some secret gang code.
Right, it's just clothing. It really shows how easily things can be misinterpreted, I guess.
Totally. Especially based on appearance or assumptions.
So, okay, flimsy initial basis. But then the source of the actual intelligence about these supposed gang ties, that gets even more problematic, doesn't it? Tell us about this confidential source and, critically, what we learned later about the detective involved. This really throws a wrench into the whole thing.
It really does. And it kind of gives you a peek behind the curtain of the system. Yeah. So the info that alleged he was connected to gangs came from an unnamed source, described as a past and proven reliable confidential source.
Okay. Standard language, maybe?
Sort of. This source claimed he was an MS-13 member, had the nickname Chile, and was active with something called the Western Clique. But here's the kicker, and his lawyer pointed this out. The Western Clique is mainly based in New York.
And he never lived there.
Never lived in New York.
Ever.
So, red flag number 1. Then red flag number 2, and this is huge, the detective. The one involved in writing up that 2019 report. He was later suspended for misconduct.
What kind of misconduct?
Giving confidential police information to a commercial sex worker. He was ultimately terminated, December 2022. Ended up on a do not call list. Basically, a list of officers deemed unreliable for testimony.
Wow. So the source is questionable, the location doesn't match, and the officer involved is later discredited.
Exactly. It casts this significant shadow over the whole foundation of those original gang allegations.
Okay, so despite all these, let's call them problematic origins, In 2019, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is actually granted withholding of removal status. What's that actually mean legally? How protected was he?
It's a really significant protection. It meant he could legally live and work in the U.S. pretty much indefinitely because the government could not execute a deportation order sending him back to El Salvador because of that danger, that clear probability of future persecution the judge found.
So it's like asylum, but not quite.
Similar, yeah. Key difference is it doesn't offer a direct path to getting a green card or citizenship. But effectively, the U.S. government was on record saying returning this person to El Salvador is too dangerous.
And there was even like a typo in the order, a clerical error?
Yes, that's another interesting detail. An acknowledged clerical error. The order mistakenly listed Guatemala as the country he was withheld from removal to.
Whoops.
Yeah, but everyone involved, the lawyers, the government, understood, based on his application form, the I-589, and just the context, that it clearly meant El Salvador. It shows that even with these little technical glitches, the actual substance, the intent of the order regarding El Salvador was crystal clear.
Okay, let's fast forward again. March 2025. Suddenly, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is on a flight to El Salvador, along with hundreds of other deportees. And you mentioned this shocking detail. Something like 90% of the people on that flight had no U.S. criminal record beyond maybe traffic stuff or immigration violations.
That's what the reporting indicates, yeah. Mostly non-criminal removals.
So how on earth does someone with a withholding order, this specific protection against deportation to El Salvador, end up on that plane?
Well, according to later testimony from an ICE official, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's protected status just had not appeared on the flight manifest.
It just wasn't there.
Apparently not. Yeah. And he was listed as an alternate. Basically, he took the spot of someone else who couldn't fly. The official also mentioned his purported membership in MS-13 again, purported, not confirmed. And crucially, Kiga wasn't charged with any crime in the U.S. at that moment.
So it sounds like a massive system failure. Someone protected, swept up in a mass deportation based on unproven stuff, and his legal status just missed.
That's what it looks like. A breakdown where the vital information didn't connect. And then, of course, he gets to El Salvador, taken to CCOT, and his family, as you can imagine, completely lost contact for a while. Utterly distressing for them.
Oh, I can't even imagine. So naturally, this sparks a huge legal fight immediately. His wife files a lawsuit, right, in Maryland.
Yeah, U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland. And the judge, Judge Paula Sinas, acted fast. She ordered the government to facilitate and effectuate his return. Now,
Facilitate and effectuate. Okay.
Yeah.
And the government's response in court.
this is where it gets wild. The U.S. government, to the court, acknowledged they knew about the withholding order. They called the deportation an administrative error. This was apparently the first time they admitted an error regarding any of those hundreds of deportations on March 15th.
That is a stunning admission, isn't it, in open court?
It really is. It shows, okay, maybe the top levels were aware, but something went badly wrong operationally. And the courts, they were not having it. The Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, they unanimously backed Judge Sinas.
What did they say?
They delivered this blistering opinion, said the government had, quote, no legal authority to snatch a person who is lawfully present without due process, called the government's arguments unconscionable.
Wow, strong words.
Very. And they issued this stark warning. Look, if the executive branch can just deport people without due process, what's stopping them from deporting American citizens or targeting political enemies? It hit right at that core separation of powers issue.
Okay, so then it goes even higher. April 10th, 2025, the Supreme Court weighs in. Unanimous ruling. They say the government must facilitate his release from El Salvador. But there is a little nuance there, right? A subtle distinction.
Yes, and it's a key legal point. The Supreme Court asked the lower court, Judge Sinas, to take another look at the word effectuate. That signaled a bit of deference to the executive branch, on foreign affairs. Getting someone out of a foreign prison is complicated diplomatically.
Well, they can't just order El Salvador around.
Exactly. But, and this is the real aha moment for you, the Supreme Court still definitively said the government had an obligation to facilitate his return. The message was clear. We might not tell you exactly how to do it, but you have to make it happen. The duty remains.
Got it. And Justice Sotomayor wrote separately, didn't she, with Kagan and Jackson, that concurrence really hammered the point home.
Oh, she did. She accused the government of basically dismissing this egregious error as just some minor oversight. And her warning was chilling. She said the government's whole argument implies, quote, that it could deport and incarcerate any person including U.S. citizens, without legal consequence, so long as it does so before a court can intervene.
So basically, act fast enough and you're above the law.
That was her fear.
Yeah.
She pointed out that every factor governing requests for equitable relief manifestly weighs against the government. It was this powerful defense of judicial oversight, saying, no, you can't just bypass the courts like this.
But even with these really strong rulings, the Trump administration seemed to dig in its heels, right? They interpreted facilitate very narrowly.
They did. Their argument was essentially, look, facilitate doesn't mean we have to arrange his release with El Salvador. It just means, if El Salvador lets him go, sure, we'll provide a plane ticket.
That sounds like playing word games.
Judge Sheenis certainly thought so. She expressed severe frustration, cited vague, evasive, and incomplete responses from the government, talked about a willful and bad faith refusal to comply. She greenlit expedited discovery, forcing them to turn over documents, make officials available for questioning. She was even seriously considering holding government officials in contempt of court.
So the judge was ready to throw down.
Absolutely. It showed a judiciary really determined to make its orders stick, even against intense executive branch resistance.
And there was also some serious drama happening behind the scenes with the government lawyers, wasn't there? It really highlights the pressure cooker these attorneys must have been in.
It's a fascinating and frankly kind of alarming look inside. There was this DOJ lawyer, Erez Ruvini. First, he gets put on administrative leave. Then he's fired. Why? For admitting in court the deportation was a mistake, and apparently for not zealously advocating the government's hardline position enough.
Wow. Fired for basically telling the truth as the government had already admitted it.
Seems like it. He later filed a whistleblower report, alleged he was actually ordered to file a brief claiming Kaag was a terrorist, and he refused. 2 other DOJ lawyers actually resigned in protest over the whole situation.
That's incredible.
It really shows the immense political pressure on government lawyers when these cases get hot. And the administration even tried to use the state secrets privilege to avoid sharing info about talks with El Salvador. Judge Sheenis pushed back on that too, eventually got some documents unsealed, though reportedly they didn't contain much new info.
Unbelievable. Okay, let's shift focus to the place at the center of this storm. CECOT. The prison itself, officially the Center for Terrorism Confinement in El Salvador. It's got this notorious reputation for extremely harsh conditions.
And there's a specific financial deal between the U.S. and El Salvador about using it.
Yes, there is. A deal was struck. The U.S. agreed to pay El Salvador about $6 million a year to house deportees there in CECOT.
$6 million a year. Yeah. It really highlights how these international policies can become, well, kind of transactional. And remember that quote from the Salvadoran official that Senator Van Hollen reported?
Remind me.
He said basically, we have a deal with the U.S. government. They send people, we host them, they pay, and that's it. Just incredibly blunt.
Wow. They send people, we host them, they pay, that's it. What does that stark simplicity tell you about the nature of this arrangement?
Well, it tells you exactly that, right? For El Salvador, it looks like a straightforward financial deal for providing a service detention. For the U.S., it seems like a way to outsource a perceived immigration problem. But it raises huge questions about accountability, about oversight, especially when you move detainees outside the direct reach of the U.S. legal system. It's a major gray area.
And the conditions inside CECOT, they sound, frankly, horrifying. Can you paint a picture?
They are. Based on all reports, we're talking large concrete cells, supposedly designed for maybe 65, 70 people, but reports say they hold up to 150.
Double capacity or more.
Easily. Just bare metal bunks stacked 4 stories high. Only 2 toilets, 2 sinks per cell for 150 people. Artificially lit 247. Temperatures hitting 95 degrees Fahrenheit.
Nice.
Prisoners apparently get only 30 minutes of group exercise a day. No visits, no letters, no workshops, no access to the outside world at all. Food is reportedly served without even basic utensils. It's clearly designed to be an incredibly restrictive, punitive environment.
And the human rights concerns go beyond just the physical conditions, right? There are alarming statements from officials and groups monitoring the situation.
That's right. The Salvadoran Justice Minister himself reportedly said that people sent to CECOT would never return to their communities.
That's chilling.
Yeah.
And human rights groups like Cristosal, Amnesty International, they've documented widespread issues during El Salvador's ongoing state of exception. Things like torture, inhumane conditions, and sadly, over 150 deaths in custody across the prison system there.
And some people have used even stronger language to describe CECOT.
Yes, some journalists, some academics have provocatively called CECOT not just a prison, but a concentration camp. They draw parallels, maybe controversially, to places like the Soviet Gulag or even early Nazi camps. The argument is that it's being used for mass detention, often without real due process, serving political ends under the guise of fighting gangs.
Heavy stuff. Okay, so inevitably, this case blew up politically back in the U.S. The Trump administration went on a very public offensive against Kilmar Abrego Garcia. What was their main narrative?
The core message from President Trump himself was that Kaag was an MS-13 gang member and a danger to the U.S. And remember, his administration had designated transnational gangs as foreign terrorist organizations earlier in 2025, so that label carried extra weight.
Right, and they pushed some specific evidence, including that really controversial image.
Ah, yes, the photoshopped hand.
Yeah.
Trump posted this image on social media, supposedly of Kaag's hand, but it was digitally altered to add MS-13 right above his actual tattoos.
What were his actual tattoos?
Things like a marijuana leaf, smiley face, a cross, a skull. PolitiFact looked into it and confirmed none of those are known MS-13 symbols. Trump was even corrected about it during a TV interview.
So demonstrably false information being pushed from the top.
It certainly appears that way. It shows a willingness to use potentially misleading visuals to really sell that dangerous gang member narrative to the public.
And other senior White House officials jumped into Pam Bondi, Caroline Leavitt, Stephen Miller, even VP J.D. Vance. What was their consistent message?
It was lockstep. The message was, Kaag should never have been in this country and will not be coming back. Period. And that deporting him to El Salvador was always going to be the end result, regardless of the courts. Caroline Leavitt claimed she'd seen a lot of evidence of his gang ties, but never really elaborated on what that was.
So just doubling down, basically ignoring the court orders publicly.
Pretty much, it set up this very direct clash. The executive branch saying one thing, the judiciary saying the complete opposite.
Trump's own stance seemed to kind of shift a bit during all this, didn't it? What did his different statements suggest?
Yeah, it was interesting. Initially, he tried to distance himself, saying he was not involved, up to the lawyers, sort of deflecting.
Right.
But later, he hinted that, okay, maybe he could ask President Bukele in El Salvador to release Kaag if he was legally instructed to. But he hasn't actually done that. He also made that comment, we cannot give everyone a trial, suggesting it would take 200 years to process all deportees that way.
Implying due process is just impractical.
That seemed to be the implication. And then Stephen Miller went even further, indicating the administration was actively looking at suspending habeas corpus for the immigration crackdown.
Suspending habeas corpus, that's huge. That's the fundamental right to challenge your detention.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone of Anglo-American law. So the rhetoric definitely escalated, showing this increasing willingness to push against established legal norms and judicial constraints.
Which brings us right back to that core due process debate. Stephen Miller had that controversial tweet saying due process is for citizens, not foreign trespassers. But what's the actual legal consensus on that? What do the precedents say?
Well, the legal consensus and Supreme Court precedent are very clear and very different from Miller's tweet. Experts and the court itself, including conservative justices like Scalia in past writings, have repeatedly affirmed that the Fifth and 14th Amendments guarantee due process to every person physically present on U.S. soil. It's not limited by citizenship status.
Every person, not every citizen.
Precisely. So this case immediately got framed as this critical constitutional issue, a real separation of powers conflict. It became a test case for how far executive power could go, especially against judicial rulings.
And Congress started getting involved too. Senator Chris Van Hollen actually went down to El Salvador.
He did. Senator Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland where Kaag lived, flew down in April 2025. He was initially denied access to see Kaag by Salvadoran officials, which caused a bit of an uproar.
Yeah, I remember that.
Eventually, he did meet with him. Kaag told Van Hollen he'd been moved out of CCOT to a slightly lower security place by then, but that the whole experience in CCOT had deeply traumatized him.
Understandably. Were other lawmakers involved?
Yes, other Democratic representatives also traveled down there. Interestingly, they had to pay their own way because a Republican committee chair denied their request for funding for an official trip. He apparently sarcastically told them to use their own personal credit cards.
Oof, politics at play even there.
Seems so. But these lawmakers, they weren't just focused on Kaag. They brought attention to other detainees too. People like Andri, a gay Venezuelan stylist whose crown tattoos were mistaken for gang symbols. Or Neri, a man who had an autism awareness puzzle piece tattoo, also misidentified.
So highlighting a pattern of misidentification or jumping to conclusions about tattoos.
Exactly, showing This wasn't necessarily an isolated issue with Kay.
What about the public? How were people reacting to all this? What did polls show?
Public opinion seemed a bit divided, as you might expect. Polls suggested that while, yeah, a lot of people support deporting immigrants convicted of violent crimes, there was much less consensus on these broader mass deportations. And significantly, a strong majority consistently said they believed the administration should follow court rulings.
So respect for the judicial process, even if they agreed with tougher immigration enforcement.
That seems to be the takeaway. Even figures like podcaster Joe Rogan, who isn't exactly known for being anti-enforcement, called deporting someone like Kaig without due process dangerous. It suggests a baseline public discomfort when legal processes appear to be ignored.
And the administration also brought up something else, Cage's wife's past protective order filings, alleging domestic abuse.
Yes, they publicized those civil filings.
Yeah.
His wife responded publicly. She explained she had sought the order years ago out of caution after a disagreement, that they'd worked through their issues with counseling, and that their marriage had actually grown stronger since then.
Okay. But there was something really shocking about how the administration released that information, wasn't there?
Yes. This was genuinely shocking. When the Department of Homeland Security posted the protective order documents online, they failed to redact her home address.
They doxed her.
Effectively, yes. It forced Keigi's wife and their U.S. citizen children to immediately move to a safe house for their own safety. A pretty egregious breach of privacy, regardless of the context of the filings themselves.
Unbelievable. Okay, let's get to the latest chapter in this saga. June 6, 2025, the administration finally brings Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. soil, complying, sort of, with the court orders. But what happens immediately?
Immediately upon his return, the Department of Justice announces he's been indicted, in Tennessee of all places. The charges: conspiracy to unlawfully transport illegal aliens for financial gain, and the substantive charge of unlawful transportation of illegal aliens for financial gain.
Based on what?
Based on his previous work as a taxi driver years earlier, his lawyers, predictably, argue this is just the Trump administration trying to save face after the whole deportation fiasco blew up on them, trying to justify their previous actions by finding some crime to pin on him.
And what do we know about the evidence for these new charges? Is it solid?
Well, the investigation apparently relied heavily on confidential witnesses, some of whom had their own pending criminal cases or immigration issues, and received cooperation deals in exchange for testifying against CAG.
Ah, the classic cooperating witness situation.
Exactly. One key witness, for instance, owned the car CAG was driving during a traffic stop back in 2022. This witness was allowed to stay in the U.S., avoiding deportation, in return for their testimony. So, standard prosecutorial tools, but ones that always invite scrutiny about witness motives.
Right. And how did the courts in Tennessee react to these charges? There was more legal back and forth there too, right?
Yes, the legal seesaw continued. The U.S. magistrate judge in Tennessee, Barbara Holmes, she initially ordered KK released pending trial. She cited a lack of evidence presented by the government at that point, calling some of it double hearsay.
So pushing back on the government's case again?
She did. Later, the DOJ pushed again to keep him detained before trial, arguing he was a flight risk or a danger. Judge Holmes denied that motion too. She ruled the government just hadn't met its burden to prove either of those things. So again, the judiciary showing careful scrutiny.
But he's not actually free, is he?
No, because Judge Holmes also noted the obvious. The second he walked out of criminal custody, ICE would almost certainly grab him again immediately for immigration detention. So to prevent him from being potentially deported again right away, he's currently being held in temporary custody in Tennessee. It's this weird legal limbo to keep him physically in the country.
Wow. And the government isn't giving up on deportation either, are they? What's the very latest plan?
No, they're not. Federal prosecutors have now told the Maryland judge, Judge Sheeness, that the government plans to start new removal proceedings against Kay Kig. But here's the twist. This time, they intend to deport him to a third country.
Not El Salvador.
Not El Salvador, presumably because the withholding order still blocks that. So they're looking for somewhere else entirely to send him. His lawyers are fighting this, obviously. They've asked Judge Sheeness back in Maryland to issue an order bringing him back to Maryland once the Tennessee situation is resolved, specifically to stop the government from whisking him away to a third country before his criminal trial even happens.
So trying to prevent another swift, possibly illegal removal?
Exactly. There's a hearing scheduled on that specific issue for July 7th, so this is still very much unfolding.
This whole case, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's story, it's clearly seen by many as way more than just one person's immigration battle. It's framed as this major constitutional showdown, right?
Absolutely. A direct challenge to the separation of powers, testing the independence of the judiciary against executive authority. And some legal scholars, historians even, have used incredibly strong language to describe its potential significance.
What kind of language?
Well, some have described the government's actions in this case as potentially marking the beginning of an American policy of state terror.
State terror, that's a heavy term.
It is. The argument centers on a few things. The state controlling language, labeling people criminals or terrorists without full process, trying to circumvent the rule of law using concepts like a leader principle or a perpetual state of exception, and effectively creating these zones of statelessness, like maybe CECOT, where legal protections seem to disappear. It's a provocative analysis, for sure, but it shows how seriously some view the precedent being set.
And didn't a separate recent Supreme Court ruling touch on something related to this? About court injunctions.
Yes, good point. On June 27, 2025, the Supreme Court ruled in a completely different case, one about birthright citizenship. But that ruling significantly limited the power of federal judges to issue universal injunction, meaning court orders that block the government from applying a policy not just to the specific people suing, but to everyone affected by it nationwide. The court said judges should generally limit relief only to the actual parties in the lawsuit.
How does that connect back to Kegi's case or similar situations?
Well, Justice Sotomayor, again, wrote a concurrence expressing deep concern. She warned this decision effectively kneecaps the judiciary's authority to stop the executive from enforcing even the most unconstitutional policies against anyone who isn't specifically part of a lawsuit.
So everyone affected would have to sue individually or form massive class actions.
Pretty much. It makes challenging broad government policies much more difficult and resource-intensive. So for cases like KK's, where the concern isn't just about him, but about a potential systemic failure of due process affecting many, this ruling could make it harder to get widespread, immediate protection through the courts.
So wrapping this all up, the fundamental quorum still hangs heavy in the air. Who actually gets due process protection in the United States? And can the government really effectively just stash away people, even people with legal protections, in foreign prisons without full legal recourse?
That's the crux of it.
This whole Kilmar Abrego Garcia case is just this living, breathing legal drama, isn't it? Constantly pushing and testing the absolute boundaries of American law, constitutional principles, basic human rights. It's such a stark reminder that these abstract legal ideas we talk about, they have incredibly real, often devastating human consequences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's not theoretical for the people involved. As this whole complex story keeps unfolding, maybe the final thought for you listening is this. What does this trajectory, this whole saga, ultimately tell you about that foundational bedrock principle of due process? And maybe more importantly, who exactly do you think is protected by the rule of law in the United States today? It's definitely a question worth wrestling with after hearing all this.